January 17, 1943, Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands. The jungle breathed with 1,000 invisible throats. Moisture hung in the air like a living thing, clinging to every leaf, every blade of kunai grass, every thread of uniform fabric. In the pre-dawn darkness, a Lieutenant Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki adjusted his field glasses, his breath slow and deliberate despite the oppressive heat that never ceased, even in these pre-dawn hours. Below him, in perfect geometric rows that seemed to insult the chaos of the jungle itself, American Marines stood in formation. They had been standing there for 43 minutes. Not one man had moved. Ichiki lowered his glasses and permitted himself the faintest smile. In his breast pocket, folded with military precision, rested a letter he had written to his wife in Kyoto 3 weeks prior. In it, he had described the Americans with the casual contempt that had become common among the Imperial Japanese Army Corps. Undisciplined individualists, soft from prosperity, lacking the spiritual iron of Bushido. Cowboys and shopkeepers playing at soldier. The formation below him seemed to confirm every assumption. What kind of army wasted time standing motionless in the tropical heat? Where was the aggression, the warrior spirit, the controlled fury that won battles? He did not yet know that he was observing something his military education had never prepared him to understand. The certainty had been building for decades. Since the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, when Japanese forces had shocked the world by defeating a European power, the Imperial Japanese military had constructed an identity around spiritual superiority. Western armies, they believed, relied on industrial might and material abundance. The Japanese soldier relied on something deeper, Yamato Damashi, the spirit of old Japan. This spirit, officers assured their men, could overcome any material disadvantage. It could transform defeat into victory through sheer force of will. The Americans, by contrast, represented everything Japanese military philosophy held in contempt. They came from a nation of comfort and excess, where young men grew soft on jazz music and Hollywood fantasies. Their Marines were recruited from a population that had never known hunger, never understood sacrifice, never been forged in the crucible of absolute obedience. Japanese intelligence reports painted a picture of an undisciplined rabble, men who questioned orders, who fraternized casually with their officers, who even had the audacity to complain about their conditions. How could such men stand against soldiers who had been trained to view death as the lightest of feathers, duty as heavy as mountains? Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the most influential staff officers in the Imperial Japanese Army, had written extensively on American weakness. In his view, American individualism was a fatal flaw. A nation that celebrated personal freedom over collective sacrifice could never produce soldiers capable of true discipline. The Americans would crumble, he predicted, when faced with the organized ferocity of Japanese assault. They would break formation, they would panic, they would reveal themselves as exactly what they were, wealthy children playing at a game that required the hardness of men. Lieutenant Colonel Ichiki had read Tsuji's assessments. He had believed them completely. And now, watching the Marines stand in formation as the sun began to rise over the Solomon Sea, he felt his conviction strengthen. This was precisely the kind of meaningless ritual that proved American military thinking was fundamentally hollow, ceremony over substance, appearance over reality. What he was watching was morning inspection. The misunderstanding was almost perfectly complete. When Japanese officers observed American military discipline, they saw only the surface, and the surface seemed to confirm their biases. American soldiers did indeed question orders, at least more openly than their Japanese counterparts. They did write letters home complaining about the food, the heat, the insects, the boredom. They did maintain a less rigid hierarchy between officers and enlisted men. To Japanese observers, this looked like chaos barely restrained. They did not understand that they were witnessing a different kind of discipline entirely. The Marines standing in formation on Guadalcanal that January morning had been standing there because their unit commander had ordered it. Not one of them particularly wanted to stand at attention in the suffocating heat. Not one of them enjoyed the sand fleas that bit through fabric, or the malaria that had already hospitalized a quarter of their division, or the constant threat of Japanese artillery that could at any moment transform their orderly ranks into chaos and blood. They stood there anyway. They stood there because American military discipline was not built on unquestioning obedience to authority. It was built on something the Japanese military philosophy had no vocabulary for: voluntary commitment to a collective goal. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, who would survive Guadalcanal and later Peleliu and Okinawa, would write decades later about the nature of Marine Corps discipline. It was not, he explained, the discipline of men who had been broken and reformed into unthinking automatons. It was the discipline of men who had been taught why their mission mattered, who understood the purpose behind every order, and who had made a conscious choice to subordinate their individual will to the needs of their unit. This discipline was harder to create than the Japanese version. It took longer to instill, but once established, it was almost impossible to break, because it came from within. The test came sooner than anyone expected. On the night of August 21, 1942, 5 months before that January morning inspection, Colonel Ichiki had led his regiment in a direct assault on the Marine positions along the Ilu River. He had expected confusion, panic, and rapid collapse. Japanese forces had trained for night attacks specifically to exploit what they believed was American weakness in close combat. The assault began at 0130 hours with the coordinated fury that had overwhelmed Chinese and British forces across the Pacific. The Marines did not break formation. They held their positions through 4 separate waves of assault. They maintained fire discipline even as Japanese soldiers charged directly into machine gun positions, screaming "Banzai!" They kept their intervals, maintained their fields of fire, and followed orders with a mechanical precision that stunned the Japanese attackers. When the sun rose on August 22nd, more than 700 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the sandbar. Fewer than 30 Marines had been killed. Colonel Ichiki, who had written to his wife about American weakness, committed seppuku rather than face the shame of his defeat. The Battle of the Ilu River was not an anomaly. It was a pattern that would repeat itself across every island, every beachhead, every jungle clearing in the Pacific War. At Tarawa, Marines assaulted fortified positions under withering fire, maintaining formation even as men fell in windrows. At Peleliu, they fought for 73 days in temperatures that exceeded 115 degrees, never once breaking unit cohesion. At Iwo Jima, they climbed volcanic ash slopes under artillery fire so intense that the entire island seemed to be erupting, and they did it in coordinated waves, following the fire plan exactly as briefed. The Japanese kept expecting them to break. They never did. The symbolic weight of it accumulated slowly, like coral forming a reef.
In every Marine position across the Pacific, there was a sound that became synonymous with American discipline, the measured cadence of orders being given and acknowledged. Squad leaders, check your men. Aye, Sergeant. First platoon, advance by squads. Aye, sir. Corpsman, coming. It was a rhythm of organized violence, a structure of controlled chaos that remained intact even when everything else, sanity, hope, physical endurance, threatened to collapse. Japanese soldiers began to write about it in their diaries. A private fighting on New Georgia recorded his confusion at watching an American patrol move through the jungle in perfect tactical formation, each man covering his sector, each movement coordinated despite heavy enemy fire. "They move like machines," he wrote, "but they fight with the fury of men defending their homes." Another soldier, captured on Saipan, told his interrogators that the most terrifying aspect of fighting Americans was not their firepower, though that was formidable, but their refusal to panic. You could kill 10 of them, he said, and the 11th would still advance exactly as ordered. The orders themselves became a kind of symbolic object passed down from officer to NCO to private with the weight of something sacred. Not sacred in the religious sense that Bushido demanded unquestioning obedience to the emperor. Sacred in the democratic sense that these orders were part of a contract. The Corps would ask men to do impossible things, and in return, the Corps would never abandon them, never waste their lives carelessly, never break faith with the mission they had all volunteered to complete. When a Marine stood in formation under artillery fire, he stood there not because he feared his officers more than he feared death. He stood there because every man in that formation had made the same choice he had, to be part of something larger than individual survival. The transformation in Japanese military thinking came too late to matter. By 1944, after defeats at Midway, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, the initial contempt for American discipline had curdled into something more complex. Japanese officers no longer mocked American soldiers as soft individualists. Instead, they began to describe them with a kind of bewildered respect, tinged with bitterness. The Americans had proven themselves capable of extraordinary endurance, tactical flexibility, and unbreakable unit cohesion. They had done so while maintaining the very individualism that Japanese philosophy insisted would be their downfall. It made no sense within the framework of Bushido. How could men who valued personal freedom fight with such disciplined ferocity? How could an army that encouraged questions and independent thinking maintain formation under conditions that broke armies built on absolute obedience? The answer was uncomfortable for Japanese military theorists to contemplate. Perhaps discipline rooted in voluntary commitment was stronger than discipline rooted in compulsion. Perhaps men who understood why they were fighting, who chose to be there, who believed in the mission not because an emperor commanded it, but because they had weighed the alternatives and made a conscious decision, perhaps such men were actually harder to break than those who simply obeyed without question. This realization filtered through Japanese military ranks slowly, transmitted through survivor accounts and intelligence reports. But it arrived too late to change doctrine, too late to reshape training, too late to matter. The Imperial Japanese Army had built its entire identity around one conception of discipline, and that conception was failing them island by island, battle by battle, formation by formation. On Okinawa, in the war's final months, Japanese defenders watched American Marines advance under artillery fire that should have shattered any formation. They watched the lines reform after each explosion, watched sergeants count their men and call for corpsmen, watched officers redirect the advance with hand signals when radio communication failed. And then they watched those same formations assault fortified positions with a coordinated violence that made mockery of every assumption about American weakness. The epilogue was written in the silence after surrender.
When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's capitulation on August 15, 1945, one of the most profound psychological shocks for Japanese soldiers was not the fact of defeat itself. Many had known for months that defeat was inevitable, but the manner of it. They had expected American occupation forces to behave like victorious armies throughout history, with chaos, disorder, and individual acts of vengeance. They had expected the thin veneer of American discipline to finally crack, revealing the undisciplined rabble that Japanese propaganda had always insisted lurked beneath the surface. Instead, American forces occupied Japan in perfect formation. They maintained discipline in victory more rigidly than they had in combat. They followed rules of engagement that prohibited fraternization, looting, and unauthorized violence. They distributed food to starving civilians with the same mechanical efficiency they had used to distribute ammunition during battle. The formations that Japanese commanders had mocked as meaningless ritual turned out to be the outward expression of something deeper, a collective commitment to a mission that didn't end when the shooting stopped. General Douglas MacArthur understood the symbolic importance of this discipline. He insisted that occupation forces maintain the highest standards of conduct, precisely because he knew Japanese observers would be watching for any sign of American weakness. The formations, the inspections, the rigid adherence to protocol, all of it conveyed a message that Japanese military philosophy had never prepared its soldiers to receive. Discipline and freedom were not opposites, they were partners. A nation that valued individual liberty could produce soldiers more disciplined than those who served dictatorships, not because Americans feared their officers more, but because they feared the consequences of failure more. They had chosen this mission. They had volunteered for these formations, and having made that choice voluntarily, they were bound to it more completely than any amount of compulsion could achieve. Years later, historians would debate what truly broke Japanese military power. Some would point to American industrial might, the Liberty ships, the M1 Garans, the endless supply chains that kept Marines equipped even on the most remote atolls. Others would emphasize air power or naval superiority, or the atomic bombs that finally forced surrender. All of these mattered. All of these played crucial roles. But there was something else, something harder to quantify in after-action reports and strategic assessments, the psychological weight of fighting an enemy whose discipline never broke. Japanese soldiers had been trained to believe that spiritual strength could overcome material weakness. They had been assured that American individualism would prove fatal on the battlefield, and then they had watched, battle after battle, as Marines in perfect formation advanced through artillery fire that should have scattered them like leaves. The formations themselves became a kind of answer to every question Japanese military philosophy had posed about the relationship between freedom and strength. You could build a nation on individual liberty and still produce soldiers who stood at attention for 43 minutes in the tropical heat. You could encourage questions and independent thinking and still maintain fire discipline under conditions of absolute chaos. You could respect the individual and still demand collective sacrifice. The Americans had proven it possible. They had proven it in every formation that held, every line that reformed after taking casualties, every inspection that continued despite incoming artillery. They had proven it so thoroughly that by war's end, even their enemies could not deny it. And on that January morning in 1943, as the sun rose fully over Henderson Field and the Marines finally broke formation to begin another day of jungle warfare, Lieutenant Colonel Ichiki, already dead by then, his ashes scattered somewhere in the jungle where his regiment had been annihilated, would never know that he had witnessed something profoundly revolutionary, the discipline of free men, freely given, unbreakable precisely because it was chosen. The formations continued, the war continued, but the mockery had ended forever, buried in the volcanic ash of islands whose names most Americans would never learn to pronounce, proven false by men who stood in line because they had decided, each one individually, that standing in line was how free people defended freedom itself.